I was struck in a recent talk by Daniel Padilla-Peralta that the question and answer conversation led to questions and dialogue about heritage and belonging. His talk was on Wiley's design iterations that gesture not only to European Renaissance, but also to West African sculpture. In the Q&A, Padilla-Peralta cited James Baldwin's essay, A Stranger in the Village, which I had just spoken about on a Bristol Morse lecture a week earlier. The essay is relevant here as well to ideas of heritage and belonging, not only as they pertain to the classics, but also in relation to the protests and collective memory, to which I will come shortly. In the essay, Baldwin describes his experience in a remote Swiss village in the 1950s, where locals had none of the savvy he possessed as a world traveler, one who lived for many years in Paris, and yet they still somehow had a sense of themselves, from his perspective, as inheritors of Western civilization. Western civilization, a phrase he uses several times throughout his writing. Baldwin has some 7,000 pages of writing, and this phrase appears, Western heritage, Western civilization, etc., a number of times across these works. In contrast to the villagers, Baldwin is dispossessed of this inheritance, what he calls a bastard of the West. Even in an obscure and remote village, Baldwin is the nigger, an outsider not only to local communities, but also to the arc of European history. Baldwin understands that even here, the African, the Black person, is akin in his language to Lucifer, the necessary nemesis of a particular mythology of death and life. The villagers, however, belong. Baldwin argues, for example, that as it pertains to these villagers in Switzerland, quote, and I'm going to put this in front of us, the most illiterate among them is related in a way that I am not to Dante, Shakespeare, Michelangelo, Aeschylus, Da Vinci, Rembrandt, and Racine. At my Morse lecture, I was thankful to Nandini Pandey for her reference to Teju Cole's response to Stranger in the Village, which Cole wrote in 2014, an essay which Padilla-Peralta also referred to in his Wanzea lecture. The echoes were so resonant that I subtweeted Padilla-Peralta so that he could see the Twitter conversation that followed my lecture, just because we were all thinking about Baldwin. Cole's essay would seem to upend Baldwin somewhat, certainly not, would seem to upend Baldwin's essay somewhat, certainly not rejecting Baldwin's list of grace or his unease, but adding to this list and maybe easing the unease a little, insisting, Cole, that his own contributions as the descendant of Blacks in America and African also matter. And he says the following, which I put in front of you for us to read together. But now the children or grandchildren of those children that Baldwin encountered are connected to the world in a different way. Maybe some xenophobia or racism are part of their lives, but part of their lives too are Beyonce, Drake, and Meek Mills, the music I hear pulsing from Swiss clubs on Friday nights. History is now in Black America. Little pieces of history move around at tremendous speed. This is a riff on Baldwin in the essay that Baldwin writes, where he says, people are trapped in history and history is trapped in people. Cole begins to riff on this notion of what history might be and where it might reside. Cole asserts that, quote, Bach, so profoundly human, is my heritage. I am not an interloper when I look at a Rembrandt portrait, unquote. And he says that although, quote, this question of filiation tormented Baldwin considerably, unquote, he, Cole, would seem to have solved the problem of heritage and belonging in ways that many classicists would recognize and embrace. Bach is everyone's property. Shakespeare winces not. Thus ends Baldwin's inner turmoil, or so it would seem. Certainly classicisms seep throughout Baldwin's work, throughout his writing. but evidence of complexity and discomfort, of a grappling with something more problematic, are there as well. And I believe we need to take this head on. On Baldwin's classicism, I'll show you one more quote from a lecture, The Artist's Struggle for Integrity, but I won't take time to read it, except to say how linked the citation is to racialized bodily trauma. While Oedipus through Freud is all over Baldwin's work, the classical references seem ever linked to what Fred Moten calls the break, which is the tear or the trauma. In the story, Baldwin's story, Going to Meet the Man, for example, he opens with an impotent character, Jesse, a white Southerner, who is unable to make love to his wife until unearthing the childhood memory that forms the substance of the narrative. Jesse's father took him to see a lynching when he was a child, and his triangular Oedipal identification with his father and his mother and the Black woman, and Black women in general. That identification, again, on one point, father, other point, the mother, also with Black women, and then the third point, the Negro victim. That triangulation arouses desire, sexual desire, and by the story's conclusion, he's able to make love to his wife. My Morse lecture traced Baldwin's fuzzy connections, to bring in Lorna Hardwick's phrase, with the Oresteia in his 1964 play, Blues for Mr. Charlie. Throughout these references, riffs, whatever we might call them, Baldwin exhibits a kind of interest in the classics that might not truly be called classicism, in the sense that he does not elevate the European precedent over and above what he wants to convey of his own experience or his own pain. And I don't want to take the time to give you a lineage of classicism as I see it, but I will say that I would start with Maya Reinhold's 1984 work, Classica Americana. I would look to Carl Ricard's body of work, such books as The Founder and the Classics in 1994. And I would propose that it's this lineage that leads to what was called Classica Africana as a subset, as Michel Ronick had put it, a subset of the broader Classica Americana. And perhaps someone on the call can remind me, but I do believe that Ronick was a student of Reinhold. So if we were to look at Baldwin in the context of this classicism, we might, if we were to think of it as classicism, we might begin to note his education, right? He didn't attend college, but his grade school teacher in Public School 24, Bill Miller, discovered his love of theater early on. His adolescent writing garnered the attention of such eminent figures as the New York City mayor then, Fiorello LaGuardia. At Frederick Douglass High School, or middle school rather, County Cullen was his teacher. And of course, County Cullen would have gone on to, would have by then actually published Medea and some other poems. Just a few years earlier, this volume of Cullen was published in 1935. Baldwin would have been 11 years old at that time. From middle school, Baldwin went on to DeWitt Clinton High School in the Bronx, a place whose notable alumni include Romare Bearden, the collage artist of the Odyssey series that juxtaposes Homeric myth with imagery that evokes the sculpture and textiles of Benin. Bearden, a favorite in the context of Black classicism. Prior to the year of Baldwin's matriculation to DeWitt in 1938, the high school had a classics department which taught Greek and Latin. And of course, you can see what I'm getting at here. If we wanted to do a classicism, if we wanted to think about Baldwin's classicism, we could certainly do that. But I'm directing us away from that. I'm sort of tongue-in-cheek giving you the biography and the notes that we might want to talk about if we were interested in classicism per se. But for the purposes of critique, it's worth my stating that I don't believe that the classicism I'm describing and classical reception studies have the same genealogy.